The Pacific skies were brutal. They stretched for thousands of miles. Blue emptiness scattered with white heat and sudden death. It was a war of endurance, fought not just against the Japanese Zeros, but against the ocean itself. In 1942, the Allies needed a miracle aircraft, something fast, long-ranged, and lethal. That miracle came in the shape of two long silver booms, joined by a central cockpit. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning. At first, the Japanese didn't take it seriously. They called it the two-tailed devil. But soon they began to fear it, because the P-38 could do something no other fighter could. It could fly farther, climb higher, and hit harder than anything in the Pacific. It became the chosen weapon of the U.S. Army Air Force's top aces. Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, Charles Lindbergh, and Rex Barber. Men who turned the Lightning into a legend. But there was something else, a secret technique, a flying method that made the P-38 almost untouchable, a trick that Japanese pilots couldn't understand, and that turned the tide of the air war. It began with a problem. The P-38 was heavy. It had two engines, two propellers, and a wingspan wider than a bomber's. In tight dogfights, Japanese Zeros could outturn it easily. On paper, the P-38 shouldn't have survived long against the agile Mitsubishi A-6M. But then, the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group based in New Guinea began experimenting. They discovered something that even Lockheed's engineers hadn't predicted. A unique aerodynamic advantage built into the Lightning's design. The twin booms gave it incredible stability at high speed. While other aircraft would shake or lose control in a dive, the P-38 could hold its line like a blade cutting air. And so, they developed what they called the boom and zoom. The trick was simple, but devastating. Instead of turning with the enemy, P-38 pilots would climb high above the Japanese formation, pick a target and dive at incredible speed, firing all their guns in a single devastating pass, then zoom back up before the enemy could react. It was a hit-and-run technique perfected by Major Thomas Maguire and Captain Richard Bong, two young pilots who would go on to become America's highest-scoring aces of the war. Bong described it simply: get altitude, get speed, get surprise, and get the hell out. The P-38's 4 machine guns and single 20mm cannon were all mounted in the nose, not spread out on the wings like most fighters. That meant its bullets converged perfectly even at long range. In a split second, it could unleash a storm of lead so accurate that it shredded enemy planes before they even saw it coming. Japanese pilots used to slow, swirling dogfights were stunned. They called the tactic impossible. They would turn to chase. But by then, the Lightning was already a glint in the sun. Climbing back into the sky, the boom and zoom became the P-38's signature move. But it wasn't just skill. It was science, psychology, and survival instinct combined. Every Lightning pilot was trained to stay patient, to never chase, to never fight on the enemy's terms. In one of the earliest dogfights over the Solomon Islands, a squadron of P-38s met a group of Zeros head-on. The Japanese pilots tried their favorite trick, a tight turn, a tail chase. The Americans didn't follow. They climbed, waited, and came screaming down from above. 1, 2, 3 Zeros down in seconds. Not a single Lightning lost. It was a new kind of aerial warfare. And it worked, because the Lightning itself was like no other plane in the sky. Each boom housed a powerful Allison V-1710 engine, driving counter-rotating propellers that canceled torque, giving pilots smoother control at high speeds. Its twin tails gave unmatched balance, and its turbo superchargers allowed it to chase bombers at altitudes the Japanese couldn't reach. The Pacific theater was now a P-38 sky. But the story of this trick doesn't end with tactics, because one mission, one secret operation, would prove just how deadly this maneuver could be. A mission so daring that it changed the entire Pacific War. It began with an intercepted message. Japan's most powerful admiral, the architect of Pearl Harbor, Isoroku Yamamoto, was planning to visit frontline bases in the Solomon Islands. American intelligence decrypted his flight plan. and the U.S. decided to strike. The operation was codenamed Vengeance. Only one aircraft had the speed, range, and precision to make it happen: the P-38 Lightning. April 18, 1943, 7:00 a.m. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. In the muggy heat of dawn, 13 P-38 Lightnings sat on the coral runway, shimmering silver under the rising sun. Each one was fueled to the limit, their long-range tanks slung under the wings. Each pilot knew this wasn't just another mission. Today, they were flying to kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. The mission had begun 2 days earlier, not in a cockpit, but in a room filled with mathematicians and radio operators. American codebreakers in Hawaii had intercepted a Japanese message. It contained Yamamoto's inspection schedule, precise coordinates, times, and routes. It was the golden chance the Allies had waited for since December 7, 1941. But there was a problem. Yamamoto's plane would be deep inside enemy territory, nearly 450 miles away, far beyond the reach of most American fighters. Except one, the P-38 Lightning. With its twin engines, long wings, and huge fuel capacity, the Lightning could fly farther than anything in the Pacific. It was the only plane capable of making the 1,000-mile round trip and still fight. So the plan was born: Operation Vengeance. Major John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was chosen to lead the mission. He was young, calm, and razor-precise, the kind of man who treated combat like geometry. His task: intercept Yamamoto's transport plane at exactly 9:35 a.m., at exactly the right spot, over the jungles of Bougainville. There was no room for error. A single miscalculation, and the Lightning pilots would arrive too early, too late, or run out of fuel over open ocean. Mitchell spread a map across the hood of a Jeep. He and his men calculated the intercept route down to the second. They would have to fly at 50 feet above the sea, below radar for over 400 miles, in complete radio silence, to surprise the enemy. Formation: the P-38s took off at 7 a.m. sharp. Their engines thundered like distant storms. For 2 hours, they skimmed the Pacific at wave-top height. Salt spray coated their canopies. The pilots said it felt like flying through a tunnel of blue fire, the ocean so close that one mistake meant instant death. At 9:33 a.m., they reached Bougainville. Mitchell gave a single hand signal. The formation split. 4 P-38s climbed to intercept the enemy bombers. The others circled above as cover. And right on time, just as the codebreakers predicted, a small formation of Japanese aircraft appeared in the distance: 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers and 6 Zero escorts. In the lead bomber sat Admiral Yamamoto. He believed he was flying safely through friendly skies. He had no idea death was already diving toward him. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove first, executing the very maneuver that made P-38 pilots so deadly: the boom and zoom. They came screaming out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour. The Lightning's nose-mounted guns opened up, 4 50 caliber Brownings and a 20 mm cannon spitting fire in a tight stream. Lanphier fired at the lead bomber. Rex Barber aimed at the second. Both Japanese planes burst into flame almost instantly. One exploded mid-air. The other limped into the jungle, trailing smoke before crashing into the trees. Of its crew, none survived. Among the wreckage later found by Japanese soldiers was a uniformed body: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A bullet had pierced his chest. The Japanese Navy was stunned. The man who had orchestrated the most infamous attack of the war was dead, killed in a precision ambush that shouldn't have been possible. The American pilots turned back south, engines roaring, flying low again to escape radar. They landed at Guadalcanal after nearly 5 hours in the air, fuel gauges nearly empty, adrenaline still surging. The mission had lasted 1,000 miles, 3:15 minutes, 600 gallons of fuel, and one perfect shot. When word reached Washington, President Roosevelt was briefed personally. The operation was hailed as a triumph of intelligence, courage, and technology, but it remained classified for months. Even the pilots were ordered not to speak of it. Officially, Yamamoto had died in combat. Unofficially, it was revenge. But Operation Vengeance was more than just a retribution mission. It proved something new about air warfare, something that would define the rest of the Pacific campaign. That mastery of speed, altitude, and psychology was deadlier than any dogfight. The Japanese had relied on maneuverability, graceful turns, elegant dogfights. The Americans had learned to fight in 3 dimensions, with energy, patience, and the physics of surprise. The P-38 was not just a machine. It was a philosophy, a weapon built for pilots who could think faster than their engines. After the mission, Major John Mitchell received the Navy Cross. Lanfear and Barber became instant legends, though controversy later brewed over which of them fired the fatal shots that brought down Yamamoto's bomber. The debate still lingers, but historians agree the success belonged to the entire team, to the precision, the discipline, and the deadly execution of a perfect intercept. Japanese morale took a devastating blow. Yamamoto had been their strategist, their symbol of confidence. His death marked a turning point. From that day on, Japan's Pacific strategy began to unravel. And for the men of the 339th, it proved one truth they would carry for the rest of their lives: that the P-38's power wasn't just in its guns or engines, it was in the mindset it gave its pilots. When the war ended, those who flew the Lightning said it was like no other plane they'd ever known. It had saved them, taught them, haunted them. In his later years, Rex Barber would look at an old photograph of his P-38, Miss Virginia, and say softly, "She could climb, she could dive, she could vanish. She was lightning, and we were thunder." By the dawn of 1943, the Pacific skies had become a graveyard of ambition. The Japanese still ruled the air over the Solomon Islands, sleek, agile Zeros slashing through Allied formations with brutal efficiency. But then came the P-38 Lightning, its twin booms gleaming under the tropical sun like a predator stalking prey. For the pilots who climbed into the Lightning's cockpit, the Pacific was not just another theater of war. It was a proving ground. Among them was Major Richard Bong, a farm boy from Wisconsin who would go on to become America's highest-scoring ace. Bong didn't just fly, he hunted. He learned how to turn the Lightning's bulk into an advantage. The Japanese Zero could outturn anything, but it couldn't outdive the P-38. It couldn't outrun it either, and that was the secret Bong and his comrades exploited. The P-38's turbo-supercharged engines gave it a crushing speed advantage above 20,000 feet. Where the thin air strangled the Zero's carbureted power plant, pilots like Tom McGuire, Charles McDonald, and Gerald Johnson learned the rhythm of the Pacific Air War. Strike, climb, dive, and vanish. They refused to dogfight. They became hit-and-run predators. It was in those skies that the boom-and-zoom tactic, the secret trick, became the Lightning's deadliest weapon. They'd climb high, spot the Japanese formations below, and dive at lightning speed, the turbochargers roaring, the guns blazing in perfect convergence. Before the enemy could even react, they were gone, climbing back into the clouds. The Japanese began calling the P-38 Two-Tailed Devil. It was a name born of fear, of silver streaks that came out of nowhere, ripped through formations, and vanished before a counterattack could form. The Lightning's concentrated nose-mounted firepower made those attacks even more lethal. Unlike most fighters, which had guns in the wings that converged at a fixed point, the P-38's weapons, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, were all mounted in the nose. This meant that even at long range, every bullet hit the same target zone. In a single 2-second burst, a Lightning could throw more metal than an entire Zero squadron. But technology alone didn't win battles. It was the men, young, sunburned, exhausted, who turned that trick into legend. They fought from jungle airstrips carved by bulldozers, their tents soaked in monsoon rains, their planes patched with sheet metal and hope. Each mission was a gamble between life and the vast blue unknown. One of the most audacious uses of this tactic came on April 18, 1943, when a squadron of P-38s was dispatched on a mission so secret it would change the course of the Pacific War. It was Operation Vengeance, the planned assassination of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor U.S. codebreakers had intercepted Yamamoto's flight schedule. To reach him, Lightning pilots would have to fly over 400 miles, undetected, at wave-top height, and still have fuel to fight and return. Only the P-38 had the range to do it. At dawn, 18 Lightnings roared off from Guadalcanal. They flew barely 50 feet above the ocean, silent and unseen. When they finally rose near Bougainville, Yamamoto's Betty bomber was right on schedule. Major John Mitchell's flight broke formation, climbed hard, and dove, the sun glinting off the twin booms. In seconds, Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier opened fire. The Betty burst into flames and plunged into the jungle. Japan's most celebrated admiral was dead. The mission was surgical, shocking, and exact, the perfect fusion of intelligence, innovation, and the Lightning's secret trick. For the rest of the war, the P-38 would continue to dominate the Pacific, flying escort over B-24s, strafing ships, and hunting Zeros over the endless blue. The twin-boom silhouette became a symbol of American vengeance and ingenuity. Richard Bong's kill tally climbed. Tom Maguire pushed even higher. Between them, they downed over 80 enemy aircraft, earning medals of honor and immortality. But both would be gone before war's end. Bong killed in a P-80 jet test flight. Maguire lost in the Philippines while trying to save another pilot. Their legacy, however, remained written across the skies of the Pacific, where the Lightning ruled, not through brute force but through cleverness, because war, at its core, isn't just about firepower. It's about understanding your enemy, exploiting their weakness, and turning your own into strength. And in the great chessboard of the Pacific, the P-38 pilots played their game to perfection, using one secret trick that made them deadly. By late 1944, the Pacific War had shifted into its final, brutal stages. The island-hopping campaign was closing in on Japan, and the once invincible P-38 Lightning still thundered across the skies. But its dominance was beginning to fade. The war that had made it a legend was now moving faster than its propellers could spin. New machines, faster, sleeker, deadlier, were rising from the factories of America. The P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wings and Packard-built Merlin engine, was now escorting B-29s deep into the heart of Tokyo. In Europe, jet fighters like the German Me-262 were rewriting the rules of air combat. The Lightning, once a marvel of engineering, was starting to feel heavy, dated, and slow. But even in its twilight, the P-38 refused to die quietly. Its pilots, those same farm boys, mechanics, and college kids who had once fought the Zero on equal terms, kept pushing their machines past the edge. At the forward airstrips of Leyte, Mindoro, and Okinawa, the Lightning's twin booms still rose into the humid dawn, shimmering like silver ghosts. They strafed convoys, cut through kamikaze formations, and hunted retreating Japanese columns in the jungles below. To the end, the P-38's reputation as a killer's machine never faltered. It remained fast, hard-hitting, and brutally efficient, especially at low altitude. But there was another reason its pilots fought with such fury. They knew their era was ending. In the skies over California, engineers at Lockheed were already building something new, something sleek, single-engined, and jet-powered. It was called the P-80 Shooting Star. It had no propellers, no turbo-superchargers, and no familiar roar. Its engines screamed instead of thundered. It was the first whisper of a new age, the sound of the future. Ironically, the man who had become the face of the P-38's greatness would never live to see that future take flight. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Major Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of a P-80 for a test flight over Burbank, California. He was calm, smiling as always, America's top ace, a hero of the Pacific. Moments after takeoff, the jet's fuel pump failed. The shooting star fell from the sky in a flash of fire. The man who had mastered the twin-boomed Lightning was gone, taken by the very future that was replacing it. News of Bong's death broke on the same day the world learned of Hiroshima. His story was buried under the weight of history. But among those who had flown the Lightning, his memory became legend. As the war's end drew near, the P-38's final missions were often strange mixtures of routine and risk. Reconnaissance pilots used stripped-down Lightnings fitted with cameras, called F-5s, to photograph Japanese positions, harbors, and wreckage from high altitude. They captured haunting images of a dying empire, bombed out cities, burned forests, and empty seas. These unarmed versions of the Lightning might have seemed harmless, but they were flying deep over hostile territory, often alone, often hundreds of miles from base. Their only defense was altitude, speed, and the thin hope that the war would end before their luck ran out. In one of the final Pacific air battles, a group of P-38s intercepted Japanese fighters near Tokyo Bay in August 1945. The Lightning pilots, veterans hardened by 3 years of blood and sun, fought one last time, executing their deadly dive and climb maneuvers like dancers in the sky. It was over in minutes. The last Zero fell burning into the sea, and the Lightning pilots returned to base to hear the words they had dreamed of for years. Japan has surrendered. When peace came, thousands of P-38s were lined up in neat rows on airfields from Guam to New Guinea. They were stripped, scrapped, and melted, their aluminum skeletons recycled into pots, pans, and peacetime dreams. Only a handful survived intact. Some were sold to South American air forces. A few became test planes. Most simply vanished, forgotten under decades of jungle and dust. But the spirit of the Lightning, that daring mix of courage and innovation, never disappeared. It lived on in the tactics its pilots invented. The fast dive attack, the surprise strike, the art of controlling the fight instead of being caught in it. These became standard doctrine for future jet pilots. In Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, you could still feel the Lightning's ghost in the way American aviators flew. The P-38 was more than a machine. It was a statement of what happens when engineering meets imagination. It wasn't perfect. It was heavy, complex, and sometimes unforgiving. But in the hands of pilots who understood its rhythm, it became poetry in motion. A flying contradiction that broke every rule and still won. Its design inspired generations of engineers. Its pilots became mentors, test pilots, and air commanders in the post-war world. And in the museums where the few surviving Lightnings still gleam, you can see the fingerprints of a time when courage and technology evolved together. When you look at those twin booms, elegant, defiant, unmistakable, you're not just seeing metal. You're seeing the soul of men who turned innovation into survival. Because in the Pacific, the Lightning wasn't just an airplane. It was a philosophy. One that said, if you can't beat your enemy in his game, change the rules. And that's exactly what they did.